Depending on if you've been hibernating over the winter or you've been slogging through soggy trails with your mountain bike, before you head out and go wild in the spring on some wonderful serpentine single track, it's a good idea to have a post-winter overhaul. Here's how. Whether you've been dragging you and your bike around some classic UK muddy, boggy trails, like Rich has, or you're just unhooking your bike for the first time this year after a fantastic ski season or fat bike season, we've got a whole heap of tips and maintenance tricks to get you back on the trails. M-Check, this is a classic, and for good reason. It's a simple, systematic way to check your bike for safety and functionality. Start at the rear dropout and move your visual gaze up to the seat collar, looking for any unusual dents or cracks or new features that weren't there before. Then scan down from the seat collar down to the crankset. Again, look at the pedals and crankset for any additional wear or any rust. Work up from the crankset up to the head tube and headset. Again, look for any signs that, well, something's unusual. If there's brown grease or extra oil leaking out of parts. Then from the headset and bars, move down through the fork crown all the way down to the fork steer, looking for stuff that wasn't there before if you've hung your bike up, or if you've been slogging through mud, is an extra feature like a leaky seal. If you've hung your bike up to avoid the worst of the winter, well done. Hopefully the ski season was lovely. You could probably skip this step, but depending on where you've stored your bike, it might welcome a dust down. But everyone else that's been bog blasting, you probably need to give your bike a very good deep clean. We've got loads of videos in our back catalogue, and all the links to those are in the description box below. With the bike clean, or at least a little bit cleaner, it's now time to look at the wheels. So spin them up. Do they look true? Do the wheel bearings feel a bit crusty? If you can check the wheel bearings now and top them up with a little bit of grease, you can make them last a lot longer, which will save you money in the long run. So if you felt the wheel bearings and they're okay, but the wheel's slightly out of true, or even if it looks okay, check all the spokes. You can save a wheel by spotting a loose spoke early before it goes out of true and pulling the rest of the rim out of shape. Time to be a tyre kicker. No, don't actually kick the tyres, but we do need to check them from bead to bead. We need to check the whole tyre for any nicks or cuts, or if you've got any plugs that have kind of migrated a little bit. So let's check the tyre. Now it's time to check the valves. It's really easy for these to get gummed up over time, either with sealant or just general trail detritus. So take them out, give them a clean. If you still can't bring them back to full health and they're kind of fantastic airflow, you can just replace them quite easily. Speaking of tubelessness, with the valve core out, it's a great opportunity to check the levels of sealant that's in your tyre. If your bike's been hanging up for a while, it might have coagulated into one point, or it might have just dried out. But you can do a really easy mess-free check with the valve core out. Just use a slim sort of 1.5 or even 2mm Allen key to slide in when the valve is at the bottom of the wheel, just to check the depth of your sealant. Most likely you'll have to top it up. If you're going to top up with sealant, make sure that you use the same brand. Here at GMBN Tyres, we use PT sealant, so we're just going to top up with more of that. But make sure that you stick to the brand that you've been doing. Some sealants don't mix. And final spinny related matter is, if you've been running mud tyres, maybe now it's time to run a chunkier tread for spring. Obviously it'll depend on your local trail conditions, but yeah, maybe it's time to get a grippier or faster rolling tyre. Time to check the rotor. So you can just spin it around and listen for any extra noise that shouldn't be there. And we can fix those really easily, and it's free speed when we do. First is to realign the caliper. So that's an easy one with either 5mm or T25. If the rotor's out of true, don't worry, there's a tool for that too, and it's quite an easy fix. Time for a pad check. Visually check them. To be especially keen, it's best to measure them. So for Shimano, we need 0.5 of pad material left on the backing plate. For SRAM, we need 3mm of the pad material and the backing plate. And for Magura, we need 2.5mm. But depending on what brands of pads and what system you're running, you might need a different measurement. But don't forget to measure. The other thing to check is your disc and how worn that is. All the different discs are going to have slightly different measurements, so get those calipers out and measure them and check that they're not too worn. If you're replacing the pads, or if you're replacing the pads and rotor, don't forget to do the bedding in process. It not only gives you better braking, but it also makes your pads last longer too. If you've taken the wheels out, do put a shim between the pads for this next step. But if the wheels are in, just give the levers a good pull. See what the lever feels like. Does it feel like it normally did? Does it feel a bit spongy? Is the lever return quite good? If it's all fine and dandy, then you should be okay. But if your bike's been hanging up or you've been bog trotting a lot, it might be time for a brake bleed. We've got lots of videos on this. All of the links of those are going to be in the description box just below. Now it's time to look at the drivetrain, or well, with this one, transmission. Essentially the tips work whether you've got electronic shifting or cable shifting, but we'll do some tips for cable shifting first. If you've got cable shifting, switch up to the top cog up here and then click to release the tension on the system and feel how that cable slides. If it's a bit crusty, you could get away with just replacing the cable. If it's really crusty and the cable doesn't want to slide at all, you might have to replace both the cables, inner and outer. With electronic drivetrain, essentially we've just got to do a visual check. I mean, of course, make sure that your battery is fully charged, but we want to check the cassette, we want to check the chainring, and we really want to check this chain. We can do a visual check on the chain just by having a look. I can have a feel and have a guess, but use a chain checking tool. It's the best way to get an idea on how worn your chain is. Chain lube is condition specific, so if it's been claggy and boggy, you've most likely been using a wet condition lube like this. Hopefully, the weather will change and spring will uncoil. Depending on how local it is and how uncoiled spring is with you, it might be time to switch to a dry condition lube like this one. Shocking news. Now we're going to look at our suspension fork and our rear shock, and we're just going to look at them. We're just going to do a visual check, check that the stanchions or the shock shaft don't have any excess wear or scratch we didn't notice last year, or a scratch that we picked up during all this winter riding. Have a look at the seals, make sure that they're all intact. Make sure that the garter seal here, the little metal bit, is where it should be and it's not popped out or it's missing bits. Also make sure that you're not leaking any oil. You can often notice this around the O-ring on a rear shock. After you've visually checked it, it's time to have a cycle of it and see what it sounds like. A great tip if you haven't been on your bike for a while and you can't remember what a good suspension fork or a good rear shock sounds like is to empty out almost all the air from the system, make a note of what your sag is and what pressure you're running, and then pump the system back up to about half. So half the pressure that you'd run in the fork and half what you'd run in the rear. Then cycle the suspension and have a feel of it. What's it feel like? Is there any knocking? Is there any kind of loose feelings that could be a bushing, could be something not quite right in the fork? And have a listen. Is it particularly squelchy? Obviously the damping is going to feel slightly off, and that's because damping is related to spring rate. So the damping will feel a bit slower than it would do with the proper air levels in it. But yeah, have a listen. Once you've felt the fork and rear shock and they feel fine, just air them back up to the levels that you used to run. Obviously be kind and gentle to yourself if you've been a little bit more content this winter and you've not done as much skiing as you did last winter. Maybe you need to put in a little bit more. So good time to get your sag levels set. If your suspension's not making any noises, you can air it back up without any problems, but if it's still making some odd noises, it's good time to check your bearings. And the squeaks could be coming from headset bearings. You'll often feel a little bit of looseness if you apply the front brake and rock the bike back and forth. But that same rocking back and forth, you can spot if any bushings are loose in the shock or if you've got any loose bearings in the suspension system. Now, the majority of them are easy to attack and easy to remedy, so just get stuck in. We've got lots of videos on how to service your suspension bearings, and we've got the links in the description box below. You might be surprised to know that some suspension systems have quite short service intervals. So with Fox, it's around 30 hours before you need to do a lower leg service or an air can service. With RockShox, depending on which ones you've got, it's a little bit longer, it's about 50 hours. That's for, again, the lower leg service and an air can service. Some of the systems need even more in-depth services like that, and you probably have to send them off. So now, just before spring fully bursts forth, it's probably a good time to get your suspension sorted. If you've not been riding your bike this winter and it's been hung up in a shed or garage, you might wonder why doing a bolt check is so important. Well, just be smart. There may have been some kind of impish fellow who's gone in and undone a bolt somewhere. So do a full bolt check. Check all the bolts, torque them up as per the manufacturer's recommendation. Don't forget that if you're using a torque wrench, that's assuming that bolt is greased and surface prepped. So I say grease, it might need thread lock, but check the manufacturer's instructions to be sure. And that impish fella often, I mean, it's my own experience I'm talking from here. I've often fiddled with a stem or I fiddled with a brake lever, either because I've needed one of those parts for another bike and then I've forgotten about it. So when it comes to spring, I've then headed out and forgotten I'd loosened that bolt. So just be really careful and really sensible and do a bolt check. Depending on how long you've been off your bike and depending on how soul crushing that last winter ride was, you might be at a low ebb. But spring is on its way, summer is coming soon, and mountain biking in all its awesomeness, not just the Type 2 stuff where you've come back and you're covered in mud and it takes you ages to get ready and ages to eat food and then you just pass out on the couch because you're so knackered. But the good stuff where you go out for a beer after or a coffee afterwards and it's just joyous. So mountain biking is glorious and soon it will be back. Bye.